welcome back to Cast Me to Hell with me, Seb, and this week, no Robbie. He is away in London where he was horrifically mown down by some intoxicating teens while cruising around Hampstead Heath. But don't worry, he is exacting his revenge and one by one hunting them down. He's got his slicker, he's got his hook, and he will return for our spoiler review next week. And talking of returning, remember to subscribe. It's the best way to get hooked by our content. Now, this week we are talking a spoiler-free review, remember that, of I Know What You Did Last Summer. Not to be confused with the original 1997 I Know What You Did Last Summer. This is the 2025 film. The requel, the reboots. Does it live up to the original? This is what we're here to talk about. Now, directed by Jennifer Caton Robinson, screenplay by Sam Lafsky and Jennifer Caton Robinson, with returning cast of Freddie Prinze Jr., Jennifer Love Hewitt, and new cast members such as Madeline Klein, Chase Sue Wonders, Jonathan Howard King, and many others. Now, I went to see this without Robbie this time, so I've seen the film before him. He's going to watch it later this week after he's done with his revenge spree. But I'm here to tell you my spoiler-free thoughts on the film. Now, this film has a very similar plot to the original. Again, no spoilers. It's pretty much given away. It's a similar kind of idea and setup. An accident happens. I won't go into detail exactly how and how it's slightly different than the original, but not hugely. We've got slightly older cast of characters than the teens from the original film. And we've got one by one them being hunted down by a person in a slicker with a fish hook. So, it's not hugely different in that way, but the approach that you'll find is actually quite different. Now, I will say that this is definitely made for a more modern audience. It is one of those things where you're either going to love or hate the new characters. I will say that certain characters such as Madeline Klein's, I've seen quite a lot of love, so I think it may be a generational thing for her character, and she does have moments and she is quite funny in parts. But she is definitely a lover or hater kind of one, where I think some people will find her extremely annoying at the same time. She does seem to have this constant kind of childlike voice and speaks as if others around her need to do it for her, which is very much in the character, but it is not the most intriguing part of a character when you're trying to build a new world, as they are here. Now, Chase Sue Wonders is kind of our key main character as Ava Brooks. Ava is kind of, as you would expect, slightly damaged. Now, after we find the events of what happens at the beginning, pretty similar to the original. Again, you know, we're setting it up, we've got a group of friends, and then this horrific event happens. And how are they changed a year later? Now, she is much more intriguing as a kind of final girl here. She's not the same as our Julie from the original, our Julie James. She has a little bit more to her. You get a little bit more characterization, I'd say. And she isn't consistently, maybe, I think a lot of people with the original, you know, Julie James, a lot of people felt that at times she was a bit of a downer. She wasn't the most fun, you know. I mean, it's hard to say. When someone is being hunted to death, that's a pretty tricky thing to do. If you want to hear more about our previous thoughts on I Know What You Did Last Summer and I Still Know What You Did Last Summer, make sure you check out our previous episodes where we have gone through both in depth. Now, to just kind of talk over the main kind of points here, the main things that I think people going into this film are going to be wondering. Are the kills? So the kills, are they bigger? Are they gorier? Yes. So the kills definitely feel a little bit more bigger. Now, I don't know if I compared it to say I Still Know What You Did Last Summer, I'd say that a couple of those kills were maybe at times a little bit more full on than we get here. But there is a variety of kills here, and I'd say this probably has the biggest body count of any of them. They've kind of come up with a good way of making sure that our main cast of characters have a lot of people around them, and of course between main and those Again, not really spoiler, no specifics, but yes, we've got a range of kills and a range of different ways of doing it. We have things such as you might have seen in the trailer with spear guns, okay, and we've got hooks, of course, and we've got many other devices that are used. We also have an interesting little play here which has a kind of how has the town changed. We have a little bit of a gentrification going on here, which affects many characters. Now, going into the returning casts, we've got Freddie Prinze Jr. back and we've got Jennifer Love Hewitt. Again, not a spoiler, it's on the poster, it's in the trailer. Now, Freddie Prinze Jr. gets a bit more to do here. I'd say maybe thinking of Deputy Dewey in the Scream Return. That's not a spoiler. I'm not saying that anything happens to him in that same way, but he's a little bit more of the grizzled kind of time. He's not so much of that at times, but we get a little bit more of him kind of, he has kind of a surrogate kind of daughter. He has a kind of that he's looking after. We get him kind of scattered and spread across the film, and his main entrance definitely seemed to get a bit of a buzz from the crowd when we watched it. Jennifer Love Hewitt, on the other hand, I feel, sadly, the Julie James saga of is she a good final girl? Now, me and Rob fought this out a little bit. Now, we both weren't the biggest fans necessarily in the first one. Again, that downer kind of constantly being where everyone pretty much said that Helen Shivers would have made the better final girl out of the two. You know, Sarah Michelle Gellar got done dirty there. Just talking of her for a second, I know the director wanted Jennifer Caitlin Robinson, had a whole kind of theory and talk about to Sarah Michelle Gellar about how can we get you to return and how could this work and what could we do, you know, to get you. And, you know, Sarah Michelle Gellar very much was on the side of, well, I was dead, you know, you can't magically make me come back to life, and you can't even pretend I didn't fully die because they saw me literally on ice. So she was very much against that. But I would say that Helen Shivers is very prominent in this film in the reflection. I'd say out of all of the characters who died, she is the one who is most kind of looked upon about hers. And we do revisit some sets and pieces from the past, which does give you a nice little bit of nostalgia. But many people would say one of the main downsides of this film is the fact that it doesn't necessarily in all ways kind of make its own new path. It feels like it sticks so closely to the nostalgia of the original that it somewhat struggles to feel like it's much new. It has bigger deaths, yes, it has some bigger set pieces, but at the end of the day it still feels like it's very tethered to the original film. In some negatives and some positives. As I said, the whole kind of idea about the gentrification of the town plays quite well into kind of how this story kind of plays at times, and ways in which our, you know, fisherman or whatever we want to call the hook killer here is actually kind of trying to make a message maybe to the town. And that kind of adds a little bit of interest, if not kind of sadly rushed. The ideas of that kind of rushed in the third act. Now back to Jennifer Love Hewitt's Julie James. Now, obviously, in the original Survivor, but as me and Rob, before I went off on that tangent, we had a little fight out about whether, you know, she is in the sequel. But I think one thing out of all the things we fought with Rob hating I Still Know What You Did Last Summer and me finding it quite fun, and I would say that weirdly this film kind of feels like it takes a bit of that and a little bit of that. In terms of I Still Know What You Did Last Summer, it kind of just glosses over the fact. There's one or two little kind of jokes at its expense, but mainly it does kind of gloss over the fact that there was this Bahamas set sequel. But Jennifer Love Hewitt in I Still Know What You Did Last Summer was a more interesting final girl. She seemed like she was a little bit, they'd taken notes that she was maybe a little bit too serious, and she had a bit more fun with it and seemed like she was enjoying it. So coming back here, I was interested in how they would approach it for her. Now, I would say that she very easily could have been cut from this entire film. And I think that that is partially due to the fact that Jennifer Love Hewitt, out of all the cast members, joined the latest. So I do wonder at one point whether she was not actually going to be in this film. and they had kind of a script, 2 different scripts, one with her, one without her, and she agreed, got the money she was asking for, and therefore they added her back in because she feels very much like she is just kind of put into it. Weirdly, Ray, Freddie Prinze Jr., feels much more natural. We know from the previous films that he was a Southport, lived there, worked there. He has a reason to stay. He wanted to stay. Now, one thing I will say that's good about the Julie James character is the way, in some ways, that they use her and don't go for some of the common tropes that you might be expecting straight away. And I can't really go any more into that without spoilers. But the downside is, she just feels like she's just there at times to be like, oh, here she is. Here's Julie James. Here's Jennifer Love Hewitt. Amazing. And she looks as good as she ever did. But she just feels a little bit tagged on at times. And I will say, if you're expecting a very kind of Jennifer Love Hewitt kind of starring role in this, I'd say think of, again, Scream, where we had Neve Campbell returning for that one, but think less and think not quite as badass as we got in maybe in the third act there. It's, this is her returning, but mainly used to spout lines from the original film and to kind of maybe play into a little bit of the third act. And that's about as far as I can say about her, because most of the stuff revolves around major plot details with her. And that's the same with Freddie Prinze Jr., to go back onto him. Ray Bronson, he's a bar owner. He has a badass kind of entrance into the film. But apart from that, he kind of plays into it, and he's kind of played off throughout the film, with a huge cast. Now, one thing I will say in terms of his character and all the other kind of characters in the film, I'd say often more pushing towards men than women, okay? But again, that is a red herring. There's lots of red herrings throughout this film that kind of do make you question, who is it? Okay, it is very much a whodunit, and that's part of the fun of these films. So, the red herrings do play throughout, whether you're looking at the size of the character, you're thinking about actions that happen in certain scenes. We have some scenes where we have a little bit more of a fight back with the fisherman. We have a little bit more of an attack and stuff like that. And you're thinking, oh, is this going to give me any clues? Is this going to help me understand? That is a kind of a good element of this film. Some of the humor works, it's really weird because I feel like this is trying to be very much kind of talking to a modern audience. And yet in some ways it feels like it's rather taking the piss out of a modern audience at the same time, because if this is what modern, kind of not teens but kind of 20-year-olds are meant to be like, if this is what we're saying is a good representation, I can't help but say that they just constantly sound like they're spouting things that just sound absolutely ridiculous. And that might be an age-based thing, but I do feel in this film it does kind of push them to be, you guys are a little bit ridiculous, aren't you? You kind of say things, you talk about things that are kind of strange to any audiences. And we have some kind of funny things played at that expense with some of the older characters like Ray Bronson, and we also have Billy Campbell as Grant Spencer, who is one of the other characters' father and kind of the mayor, who I guess could be seen as another kind of bad guy in this. Now, one thing that I do really enjoy about this film is the fact that I think it plays quite well as just a throwaway kind of slasher. I think there is fun to be had here. There's lots of good ideas at play. And I'm going to add a little thing in here. There are, we've got original returning. We've got lots of Easter eggs and references to the past, which I think fans of the original film are really going to like. There's even something a little bit bigger in there. I'm not going to spoil it, but it might get a good reaction. It's a very it might be a bit divisive. It feels a little bit out of place, and yet I couldn't help but enjoy what happens in the scene. And I have to be so vague around it because I can't really... It will spoil it. It will completely spoil the part of it. And I think this is one I didn't think it was happening, so I thought, this is great. But so characterization is pretty strong. I mean, there are a few kind of things that I think have almost started to become kind of tropes of certain characters. Like we have Ava's character. who is very much kind of, she's a little bit damaged. We have some dialogue that feels a little bit stunted, that feels a bit like in your face. It's like, we get it. We would have got it from the shot. You don't need to say that, guys. And we also have some kind of, I don't know, I feel as if this whole, they're damaged, so they're experimenting with everything and anything, and they want to be damaged themselves, is a little bit kind of, it feels like we've seen this so often, but it feels like you can have a more complicated character without them having to be like, oh, I'm going to sleep around, or oh, I'm going to experiment with anything and everything, or oh, hurt me to hurt yourself. It gives a kind of questionable message, I think, about that in this film, which is maybe best shown by the Milo character, the Jonah Howard King, who has this kind of slightly funny, but also I think if you look into it, and you might recognize the scene when you watch it that I'm talking about, but slightly kind of disturbing kind of thinking way that I don't think gives a very positive message. Now, obviously, again, I'm not describing any kills, and I will just talk a little bit about the kind of the running time and the third act. Now, the running time is 111 minutes, which makes it the longest film in the franchise. And I'm not going to lie, tonally, it feels like there was some good stuff that could have been cut here. It feels really like it's trying, it gives you a good amount of people to be slaughtered. Again, I do think that maybe some of the slaughterings actually could have gone harder than they do. It is a 15 in the UK, so, I was expecting it to be a little bit lower, graphically, but it has a few kind of gory parts to it, and it has some really cool set pieces with the gore, or the aftermath of the gore. There are some really cool after kind of what you see after the people have died. But generally, I felt like it was spreading itself quite thin by kind of trying to delve into these characters, give us a huge array of kind of people to kill off, so much so that when we get to the third act, it feels like it should have been pushed a lot earlier. I will admit we have kind of multiple kind of twists going on here. What you think, something you might think disappointing, and then something that's going to be divisive. It's going to depend on how much you love these films, and it's something, all I will say, that people always wonder when they do these requels or things like this with certain characters, whether they're actually going to go with this kind of approach. I'm trying the hardest not to say any more than that. So there's something they go with, and I think it will be a huge divisive thing about whether people like it or don't like it with this franchise. But what I can say is, and I wasn't completely against it, I just wish in the third act they'd given it way more time to breathe, and that had been more of the focus, instead of doing a twist and that isn't really that interesting and is a bit of kind of the weakest parts of the film, and then doing another twist that feels sadly like it was a kind of more of a footnote, when really that should have been a big final act. And you will get it when you get there. I had a feeling very early on in the film that this is where it was going, and yes, then it diverted my expectations, but when it happened, I was like, okay, I could kind of see the signs on the wall throughout the film. And it does have, kind of some themes, like talking of, how people need to think about therapy and how they need to get over the past and things like that, which are very interesting themes at play. But yeah, the third act sadly feels really rushed. And, the use of original characters and new characters, including a kind of a final scene that is, I don't know, it's played off so light-heartedly, you'd think the rest of this film did not just happen, and that many people have lost many friends and family, and that a whole town is kind of, in a state of disrepair. But now it's fine, have a drink, get a burger. Again, I don't think that falls into spoiler territory, but we shall see what you think when you watch the film yourself. So, obviously, the film is now available in UK and America, and I think the majority of the rest of the world have now got it. Me and Rob will be back with a spoiler review, but for my closing thoughts on the film itself. I think it's an enjoyable date night movie. I think you will have fun with it. If you liked the original, you might enjoy it. If you didn't like the original, you also weirdly might enjoy this because it's somewhat different in tone. But sadly, the long running length kind of makes it so it feels tonally all out over the place. It has a stronger kind of opening. It gets into a good amount of kills, but it also feels like it takes too many gaps between some of the kills that you start to kind of lose the momentum. And outside of a few interesting kind of kills, mainly, sadly, a cast of characters that seem very interesting at the beginning slowly seem to just kind of disappear, and we kind of lose track of them, and it starts to lose real momentum across the whole film. But I still think it's enjoyable. I don't really know where I would place it within these. I feel like maybe in my spoiler review I will decide where it will rank. But right now I think I'm going to leave that and give myself some time to think about that. One other thing I will state, because people always want to know it, and I didn't know it. I actually didn't see this. I found it out afterwards. There is a post-credit scene. It goes MCU on your ass. And from the sounds of it, it's setting up something else. Now, considering what sounds like it was quite a low budget of 18 million, and so far it's already made 24 million. Yes, it's made enough, but it's also not sounding like people are thinking that this is actually a smash hit. It's not a Scream, it's trying very hard to be. The approach and style of this in some ways is very much Scream, and it always was chasing Scream's tail. But whether it's actually going to be able to build more than this sequel, I don't know. I personally, at the end of this film, without knowing the post-credit scene part, felt that if there wasn't much place to take it, even though it does leave a hint of something that could be a returning character or something like that, I don't really think it left too much, and I don't know. It didn't make me love it enough that I'm like, oh yes, I want more of these films. But if this were the end of the franchise, forgetting the credit scenes, I think it's fine. It works as it is. It pretty much stays with what was not a critically acclaimed series, goes out in a kind of enjoyable, kind of fun, but at the end of the day, a little bit of a forgettable slasher once it's all said and done. So, thank you for listening. Again, me and Robbie will be back with the spoiler review next week. And remember, if you really want to get hooked on our show, then make sure you subscribe and leave us a lovely rating and review to help our podcast grow. We will see you next week. Bye-bye.